We learned a poem when we were growing up. It was a very important, very informational poem. One that told us what it was that made up a person. It wasn't like other poems, which just mused about inconsequential, insubstantial things like faith, hope, charity, love. No, indeed. Instead, this poem was more like a recipe, and if one could find all the ingredients in the proper quantity and mix them up with the proper methods and then perhaps bake them or cook them at the proper temperature for the proper amount of time, one might get, it seemed to promise, real boys and real girls out of the oven at the end of it. Immediately, of course, we spotted the problem with the list. It wasn't just that the recipe left a lot up to experimentation by not including any of the necessary quantities, ratios, or instructions that would be needed to successfully create a young person of the human sort. It was that the list of ingredients itself was sort of questionable. Chances are you probably know the poem too, or at the very least, two specific lines of it, which, really, are the two we are most interested in. Here they are. What are little boys made of? Snips and snails and puppy dog tails. That's what little boys are made of. What are little girls made of? Sugar and spice and everything nice. That's what little girls are made of. And you can see where the problems begin. If you want to make a little boy, you first have to work out what a snip is. And once you've discovered it's probably some sort of eel, you have to source the eels and snails, and then somehow acquire an unspecified quantity of puppy dog tails, assuming you even want to carry on with the project at that point. And probably the puppy dogs would much prefer you didn't, given what you'd have to be doing to get them. We suppose you could probably hang around the veterinarian's clinic waiting for the Doberman litters to come in, but then you have a whole new problem with timing and explanations, and no doubt more than a little time spent talking to both the SPCA and Children's Services. Anyway, it's clear that mostly what boys are made of is two potentially slimy things and one fuzzy, bloody thing. Nasty. And anyway, as boys, we have to disagree with the whole recipe in the first place. We're pretty sure that's not how it works. But at least girls are made of more pleasing things. Sugar is nice and sweet, and spice is aromatic and tasty. But then, of course, you have the general category of everything nice, which again is one of those hard-to-acquire, intangible ingredients guaranteed to cause problems. How do you know when you have everything nice? Is there a list to check against? And how much of it do you need? And exactly at what point do you add the chemical X? The larger problem is this. Sure, you might think the ingredients for boys are pretty awful. Eels and snails and detached puppy dog tails? Yuck. They sound terrible and disgusting. However, the ingredients for girls are even worse. In fact, it might be said that the ingredients for girls are very nearly the worst things ever, and the cause of more suffering, death, and oppression than any other ingredients you might care to name. Because sure, sugar and spice smell nice and make things taste better, but their history is nothing to be admired. If that's how we've been getting girls all these years, then girls have a lot to answer for. This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddlebag. Now understand, we don't want to detract from your enjoyment of such things as eating cinnamon rolls and demonstrating your culinary pretentiousness by carrying a nutmeg seed and tiny grater about your person at all times. After all, you never know when there might be a national nutmeg emergency that requires your particular skills and equipment to save all of humanity. Best to be prepared. No, far be it from us to roll our eyes in your general direction and avoid you for the rest of the evening. That's certainly not something we would do. But we do feel that a lot of the things we take for granted could do with a bit more examination and a clearer understanding of how they came to be the way they are. especially things that seem to drive a great enthusiasm for no particular reason other than only being commercially available at a particular time of the year. Take, to pick a totally random example which we will then build an entire episode from, pumpkin spice anything. Lots of folks sit around all year waiting for the advent of the so-called pumpkin spice season, usually heralded by the coffee giant Starbucks announcing the return of the pumpkin spice latte for a limited time. Limited only because they don't want you becoming immune to the allure of the seasonally appropriate flavors and smells of a drink which virtually guarantees a successful year for them. It was estimated that between launching the pumpkin spice latte in 2003 and the fiscal year 2013, the coffee chain sold over 200 million pumpkin spice drinks, and things have only gone up since then. Not just for them, mind you, but for hundreds of other brands that have jumped on the pumpkin spice bandwagon as well. Ice cream, candy, candles, air fresheners, toilet paper, and whatever else the spice can be crammed into have all been hugely successful sellers. By 2016, pumpkin spice edibles were worth about $500 million annually. Heck, even our number one dog has special seasonal crunchy treats that are pumpkin and spice flavored. And she'll eat literally anything that even vaguely resembles food. She needs pumpkin spice flavored goodies like we need another couple hundred unfinished video games. And yet she has it. Why? Well, because we like pumpkin spice, and see no reason she shouldn't as well. Its particular spiced combination not only smells and tastes good right in the moment, but its general association with the majority of American households, if nowhere else, is one of comfort and contentment brought about by the seasonal gatherings of friends and family around Thanksgiving and Christmas time, which is when one usually encountered pumpkin spice before all this nonsense began. But it isn't as if Starbucks invented the stuff, or was the first to package it and sell it to folks. McCormick and Company, sellers of spice and related baking goods, has been selling pumpkin pie spice in a package since 1934, and was doing reasonably well by it for quite some time until all of a sudden, everyone was selling it commercially in a variety of special blends with upscale ingredient sourcing. And it's here that things become strangely familiar seeming. See, if you know the history of spices, you begin to appreciate how the present pumpkin spice craze mirrors the craze for spices in bygone times. Or at least, times we hope are well bygone. But first, let's establish the generally accepted ingredients that go into making a batch of pumpkin spice, so that we can then examine each of them and see where they lead us and what we might want to understand about the world of spice before we go off the deep end. If we haven't already. Because between what little girls are made of and the annual demand for pumpkin spice, we tread an unpleasant road to get where we are today. Examples of recipes for pumpkin spice date back at least as far as 1796, and the American Cookery Cookbook by Amelia Simmons. In the book, Simmons instructs the reader to take a quart of stewed and strained pumpkin and add to it cream, eggs, sugar, mace, nutmeg, and ginger, mix it all into a paste, pour it into a crust, and bake it for 3/4 of an hour. And that is still, with only a few alterations, the basic pumpkin pie recipe. The full modern spice list for pumpkin pie spice is cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, and generally allspice, though this last seems to be mostly optional. The reason allspice is optional is that it exhibits flavors already present in the other ingredients. In fact, the name allspice comes from the complex compound flavors of cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg that allspice delivers all on its own. Not that it was a mix of all spices, but that it tasted like all spices, or at least quite a few of them. If one wanted to get extremely technical about allspice, and we usually do around here, it should be called pimento. At least that's what the Spanish called it, because when they discovered it growing in the West Indies, they really hoped it was some of that much coveted pepper they so desperately wanted to find in order to make Columbus's journey to the New World financially rewarding. Well, his second journey. And the Spanish for pepper is pimiento, not to be confused with what you find in an olive that's been drowned in a martini, though we expect people will. Allspice is the dried fruit of an evergreen called Pimenta dioica that grows natively in the West Indies and Latin America. Initially, the natives in the region used the dried berries to flavor and preserve meat, and when Columbus landed on their shores in 1494, the Spanish settlers he brought along adopted the practice as well, and thus was jerky born. No, seriously, the word jerky comes from the Peruvian root word charqui, and was used when referring to the method of preservation being used by the Spaniards. It was a short trip from there to being the name for various dried and preserved meats around the world. Unfortunately, the Spanish brought something else with them as they attempted to extract value from allspice: thousands of West African slaves. With these, they began setting up plantations and cultivating not only allspice, but coffee and sugar as well. Often these crops would be grown in the same plots of land, the allspice trees growing over the top of the coffee bushes and providing shade to them. Europe took a while to realize the value of allspice, though. In part, this was because the growers were protective of the plants and would not allow live ones to leave. Attempts were made to grow the plants from seeds, but these failed to germinate. The restrictions in trade and availability drove prices gradually higher, making the spice unaffordable to all but the elite. It wasn't until 1655, when Britain took over Jamaica from the Spaniards, that supplies picked up, and the eventual discovery that the seeds needed to pass through a bird first in order to germinate properly finally helped cultivation of the plant spread to other parts of the world. Soon, the price had come down far enough that allspice could be afforded by most people. By 1858, 9 million pounds of allspice were being exported from Jamaica alone, and the spice was well on its way to a proper appreciation. Cinnamon, on the other hand, has long been appreciated, but not always as a spice. As early as 2000 BCE, the Egyptians were importing it from far-off lands to use as an ingredient in embalming, and as an aromatic in incense, but the problem was, no one knew where it came from. According to the Egyptians, they got it from the land of Punt. Punt being a place no one has heard of at all from anyone other than the Egyptians. There's no record of it anywhere, and the best guess is that the Egyptians were referring to a general region of the world, rather than any one specific place. Even then, it is more likely that cinnamon came to the Egyptians from elsewhere and was traded to them in the land of Punt, rather than originating there. Practically everyone who did know where cinnamon came from and how it was acquired did their best to hide these facts from everyone else, though. Cinnamon trade was very lucrative, and the value was in controlling the means of production and the supply. If just anyone knew where to go to get it, then the Arab traders who were brokering the deals would lose out. No less a figure than Herodotus himself, see our episode on history, related a story told by Arab merchants and Muslim traders that sounds suspiciously like a story we told you about Sinbad way back in our episode on the Rook. The Arabians say that the dry sticks, which we call cinnamon, are brought to Arabia by large birds, which carry them to their nests, made of mud, on mountain precipices which no man can climb. The method invented to get the cinnamon sticks is this. People cut up the bodies of dead oxen into very large joints and leave them on the ground near the nests. They then scatter, and the birds fly down and carry off the meat to their nests, which are too weak to bear the weight and fall to the ground. The men come and pick up the cinnamon. Acquired in this way, it is exported to other countries. Patently ridiculous. But these were the sorts of stories you had to tell when you didn't want to say things like, "Oh, cinnamon? Well, it comes from this place called Sri Lanka, which is just over that way across some water and just grows on the trees free for the taking." Because you wanted to keep making money as a Muslim trader and not have to switch careers midstream. But for several hundred years, these absurd stories were sufficient to keep the secret. It wasn't until the early 16th century, when the Portuguese showed up, that the rest of the world really learned that cinnamon came from the coast of Sri Lanka, grew on trees from the laurel family, and was really just bark peeled from the trunk of the tree during the rainy season and rolled up by hand. Of course, the people of Sri Lanka had been harvesting cinnamon for years. They turned it over to the state as payment for taxes, and the state then made it available to the Arabs and Muslims as trade goods, who then cornered the market to the rest of the world. The Portuguese allowed this to continue, but also decided that things would be much better if they ran it all, and so forced the king of Sri Lanka's Kotte Kingdom to sign an agreement whereby the fort the Portuguese had built there would be supplied with 534 pounds of cinnamon a year. The elephants that were part of the deal were probably just there to help carry it all. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, the Portuguese were ousted in 1658 by the Dutch East India Company. And someday we'll have to do an episode about them, but for now, just think of them as the world's first and largest ever megacorporation. Yes, even larger than those on offer today. They were big and they were everywhere. If there was a pie anywhere in the world, the Dutch East India Company had at least 2 fingers in it at all times. And probably those fingers were attached to a variety of different sorts of slaves. It's not unreasonable to say that everything we accuse modern megacorporations of applied at least twice as much to the Dutch East India Company. Heck, they even invented a lot of it. But as we said, that's all for a future episode. Eventually, the VOC, as it was also known, got a bit too big for its britches, and in 1815 Sri Lanka was taken over by the British. But by then, rabid interest in cinnamon was fading. Still, it had quite the run for several hundred years, which is a longer run than most fads get. It just wasn't used in the same way we use it today. During the Middle Ages, it was less a food flavoring and more of a perfume. Mixed with fat or oil and then warmed, its intoxicating scent was enjoyed in all the best European courts. And as we mentioned earlier, the Egyptians used cinnamon in their embalming, but not for the reasons you might think. The Egyptians weren't interested in using cinnamon as a preservative or a deodorant, though it could do both those things. It was more intended to confer sanctity by way of blessing a soul's passage from this world to the next. And that was because of cinnamon's other association with a very famous bird. There lived in paradise a majestic bird called the phoenix. Like everything that lives in paradise, the phoenix had a good life, which it quite enjoyed, seeing as how paradise was so perfect and beautiful. Well, nearly perfect, because even in paradise, things age, and eventually the phoenix began to feel the weight of its 1,000 years of life. Perhaps, the phoenix felt, it was time to move on. Perhaps it was time to be reborn into a new, fresh phoenix. And this it decided to do. The great bird, dressed in its finest red and gold plumage, left paradise and flew west. It was, of course, impossible to die in paradise, but in our world, the mortal world, it could. And so it headed out ever westward until eventually it reached the vast spice groves of Arabia, where the best herbs and spices grew. Only the finest would do, and it especially sought out cinnamon with which to line its nest and make its funeral pyre. Once the bird had collected all the finest cinnamon it could, it continued its journey until it reached Phoenicia, so named because of the bird. There it built a nest made from the herbs and spices it had gathered, taking special care to line the nest with the cinnamon bark it brought and to cover itself with even more. Once done, it turned to face the east and await the rising sun. The next morning, as the sun god dragged his chariot across the sky, the phoenix raised its voice in song as the sun peeked over the horizon. And the song it sang was so enchanting, so beautiful, so haunting, that not only would people for miles around stop to listen to it, so too would the sun god himself stop and listen to its musical perfection, each note sweeter than the sweetest honey. When the phoenix finished its song of farewell, the sun god would again ready his chariot and, starting out across the sky once more, cause a spark to fall and ignite the bird's nest. The nest, the spices, the herbs, and especially the cinnamon, along with the phoenix, would be completely consumed, and nothing would remain behind except one tiny little worm in the ashes. However, 3 days later, the worm would transform and a new phoenix would arise from the ashes. The freshly reborn bird would gather up the remains of its former self and take them to Heliopolis in Egypt, before returning to paradise to pass the time for the next 1,000 years and the continuation of the cycle. And so, a perfect creature from a perfect place, preparing its own funeral pyre so that it could be cleansed and reborn anew, couldn't help but attract the attention of people who wanted to make sure that their recently deceased would enter paradise in as pure a state as possible. If cinnamon was good enough for the phoenix, well, it was probably good enough for a dead pharaoh, too. But we're not done yet. We have yet to prove our assertions that the history of spices, particularly pumpkin spices, is something to take note of and acknowledge, rather than being ignored in favor of frivolous consumption. There's more to say yet, and certainly more ingredients to say it about. But for that, you'll have to wait until next episode. Thanks for listening to this episode of GM Word of the Week. What with it being November and all, and pumpkin pies being the sort of thing you get in November, at least in America, we thought it might be fun to look at some of the history behind the spices involved. We hope you'll come back in 2 weeks for the second half. This episode, and many others like it, are made possible by the many supporters on our Buy Me a Coffee page. We're transitioning away from Patreon and on to Buy Me a Coffee. So if you're still a Patreon supporter, now is a good time to change over. You'll retain all your benefits, like transcripts and early episodes, plus be able to support both GM Word of the Week and Folklire, our newest show. Head over to buymeacoffee.com/fiddleback and check it out. New members are always welcome as well. So far, we're finding it to be a much better experience there. If you don't know what Folklire is, we can only wonder where you've been for the last couple of months. Folklire is all about folktales from all over the world, but with a twist. 2 of the stories are genuine, true folktales, retold in my own particular style, but the third one is a completely made-up story I came up with just for the episode. If you can figure out which one is which, you could win one of our luxurious mugs. Head over to folklire.com and see what we've done so far. Valuable information for this episode came from the Book of Spice, From Anise to Zedoary, by John O'Connell. GM Word of the Week is a Fiddleback production and is researched, written, and produced by Brian Casey. Music is provided by Blue Dot Sessions. Bees do have a smell, you know. And if they don't, they should, for their feet are dusted with spices from a million flowers.